good day everybody. This is Chris of the Ancient Scholar. I hope this video finds you all doing well. So today what I'd like to do is I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the vaccine booster situation as it pertains to the United States. And I may be taking somewhat of a contentious view, and so I do want to preface this video very quickly before I move into the meat of the discussion. So first and foremost, I want to say that I am absolutely and unequivocally in favor of vaccination. I am absolutely pro-vaccine, and it doesn't really matter which of the three approved vaccines we have here in the United States, the Johnson & Johnson adenovirus vector vaccine, or the two messenger RNA vectored vaccines, the Pfizer BioNTech or the Moderna. The discussion for today is going to focus primarily on the Pfizer BioNTech, since that's where all the most contemporary discussion is revolving around, although there has been subsequent discussion surrounding Johnson & Johnson and even Moderna. We'll see what happens. No substantial evidence has been brought forward that has been discussed as robustly as the Pfizer BioNTech situation. So as many of you are probably aware, there was an FDA advisory panel that met a little over a week ago to look at an application that Pfizer had put forth to try to get approval for the booster, or essentially a third dose of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. So right now, Pfizer is actually, quote unquote, fully approved for the general use in older adolescents or older pediatric adolescents and adult patients via the FDA, whereas the other two, the Moderna and the Johnson & Johnson, are under an emergency use authorization, or EUA. So I want to talk a little bit about what the data was. I'll be fairly general, but we'll talk about kind of the three pillars of what was in this packet that Pfizer put forth in this FDA advisory panel, and I'll give my thoughts. I want to be very clear. These are my thoughts, and my thoughts alone. They do not reflect my employer or anyone else that I may be associated with. And again, I do want to be sure to preface this video by saying that I am absolutely and unequivocally for vaccination. I have been, quote unquote, fully vaccinated. I was actually able to access the vaccines early. I got my first vaccine on December 31st, 2020, and then subsequently was fully vaccinated January 21st, 2021, because I was actively working as a COVID nurse. I was working in a COVID unit at that time, so I was able to have fairly early access to that vaccine. So I do want to be very clear on what my stance regarding vaccination is before I go into this, because I do understand that there is a fairly substantial population of people that are very anti-vaccine and will take any and every advantage, whether it is honest or in poor faith, to use somebody's words to push their anti-vaccine agenda. And I do not want anyone to do that with my words, and so I want to be very clear and very unambiguous about where my personal stance is on vaccines. I'm not going to discuss all of the contentious debate surrounding so-called vaccine mandates, although I do have ideas, but that's outside of the scope of this particular video. Perhaps if people want to hear my ideas on mandates in general, I could do another video, but that will not be the purpose of this particular analysis. Okay, so let's move on to what Pfizer brought forth. So there are really three major lines of evidence that Pfizer put forth in their packet for the approval of these so-called boosters. And they really come down to, if I want to summarize in a few short sentences or less, The first one is there seems to be a decrease in immunity over time. Approximately 6 to 8 months following the second vaccine, Pfizer is saying that the immunity is decreasing. Okay, so that's the first line. The second line says something like, giving a booster causes an enhanced immune response that may protect people from COVID better, may provide better protection for COVID. I'll get into the nitty-gritty here in just a little bit. I'm just summarizing right now. And then 3 is they purport to have, quote unquote, real world data that shows people have a decreased risk of getting COVID following a booster. So those are the 3 lines. So let's talk about these in some detail. So let's talk about the first line evidence, and this is like the first, essentially the first, I don't know, third or so, about the first third of the application evidence. And so this is the Pfizer is purporting there's a decreased immunity over time. So what does that really mean? Well, what they did was they looked at the time since vaccination, since people were fully vaccinated, and the number of breakthrough infections. And this is data, I believe, out of Israel. And what they noticed was that the longer you go after your second vaccine, it seems to be more breakthrough infections, okay? And I should say that this, as far as I'm aware, this is still a preprint paper. It has not been peer reviewed, and I don't even know if the actual conclusions, right, the methods and the conclusions and the calculations that were used have even been double checked by peer review at this point. I'm not entirely sure. And so essentially what they did is they looked at people that were vaccinated back in January and February, a group of people there, and they looked at another group of people that were vaccinated in the March-April time frame, and they said, hey, people in this first group, that were vaccinated, right? Yeah, so these are one group of people that were early adopters, and then another group of people that were fully vaccinated later on, right? And what did they said, oh, hey, the people that were more recently vaccinated don't have as many breakthrough infections, therefore immunity must be waning over time. However, there's some problems with that. There are lots of things that they didn't account that are really hard to account for. Are there behaviors, jobs, conditions that maybe people in the first group have or people in the second group have that can account for this signal that apparently exists? They did try to account for the age, the gender, and some chronic illnesses, but there's no accounting, as far as I can tell, for like behavior, social distancing, mask wearing, what they did occupationally. I mean, is this, the first group might be a bunch of people like me who are working with super sick COVID patients every day of our lives, and we're just getting just splattered with COVID all day long. Well, then maybe we're going to be at higher risk for COVID, regardless of the immune response we have, just because there's constant exposure. Who knows, right? You've got to account for that. So yeah, and the other thing that this paper did is it looked at kind of the relative risk, and there's some real issues with this. And they said, oh, look at this huge relative, 53% or something like that, 50% relative decreased relative risk in the people more recently vaccinated. And they didn't even look at the absolute risk, like, let's dig down a little bit, and what is the absolute risk reduction that we're seeing? And if you do that, the signal's actually pretty poor, okay? So that's the first pillar right there. Pretty shoddy evidence, in my humble opinion. Let's move on to the second pillar. The second major pillar, let's dive into some detail here. So essentially what they did is, so the phase 3 trials that were used to get the initial EUA in the United States were really gold standard, were large randomized controlled clinical trials and involved tens of thousands, about 40,000 people, right? Huge, big trials, large numbers of people, very strong signal. Oh, yeah, it was done right, which is in stark contrast to what's being presented here, in my opinion, of course. So when we look at this, what they did, and I believe this is also out of Israel, a lot of this data that is in this, that Pfizer put in their packet comes from Israel and a couple of other countries. What they did was, this group of tens of thousands of people that were originally used in the initial phase initial phase 3 trials, they took about 300. It was about 300 of the people. And so essentially what they did is after the initial part of the phase 3 trial, those endpoints were met. They followed most of these people. They try to follow after the approval, just for long-term, post-market surveillance and things like that, to see if long-term issues arise. So they took like 300 or so of these people. These people were not randomized. In fact, I have no idea how they were selected, right? Maybe they were randomized, but there's no information. So I have to assume there's really no randomization, other than, well, they just selected people willy-nilly. That's not really randomization in context of performing a proper clinical trial. Of those people, half a dozen of them were actually given the wrong booster shot. I believe they were given a booster for some specific variant and not the original Pfizer vaccine that is going to be used in the upcoming boosters. I mean, it's remarkable that they were at least transparent enough to put this in there to say, hey, we accidentally gave half a dozen people the wrong shot, but that does still raise a fairly substantial red flag, in my humble opinion, of course. So all 300 or so people got the booster, all right. There are no controls. Well, there was a kind of control that was used. It is something called a historical control, where they used the rest of the phase 3 participants who did not receive did not receive the booster. They used them as basically control versus these 300 people. You can see there are some potential issues there, hopefully. And then what they did was they looked at the antibody response, drew antibody titer, and surprisingly, they noticed the people that got the booster had a much higher antibody titer. They had a higher concentration of antibodies in their blood versus the people that didn't get a booster. Wow, remarkable, surprising, right? So essentially what Pfizer's saying is they're using the antibody titer as a kind of, we call this a surrogate endpoint. So basically what they're saying is that antibody titer is a surrogate for an immune response, right? They're like, hey, elevation antibodies equals an increased immune response equals better immunity against COVID-19 or against SARS-CoV-2, right? Maybe. That's when you study immunology, it's not really how durable immunity works. Anytime that you get vaccinated, anytime you get infected for that matter, we're talking about natural immunity, and natural immunity is most certainly playing a factor in this pandemic, right? Let's not discount that. But either way, if you get vaccinated or you get naturally infected, you're going to have a large spike in your antibodies, right? Your plasma cells are going to be cranking out antibodies, and then as you get that infection under control, right, you don't need plasma cells pumping out antibodies all the time. So what happens is those plasma cells essentially transition into a dormant state. They quit pumping out antibodies, and then when you come into contact with that infectious agent, be it a virus or a bacteria. In the future, those plasma or those dormant plasma cells, those lymphocytes, can be reactivated again and start pumping out antibodies again. So yeah, your antibody titers will decrease over time, but that does not necessarily mean that you are incapable of mounting an immune response, right? This is very predictable, right? So decrease in antibody titer does not equal a decrease in the ability for the immune system to mount a response. And looking at antibodies says nothing about the whole other part of your immune system, of the adaptive immune system, that doesn't involve antibodies directly, but it involves what we call your T lymphocytes, specifically your cytotoxic T lymphocytes that are able to identify when cells in your body have been infected and then kill those cells off before they can spread that infection throughout your body. That's called your cell-mediated response, which is probably, I don't have great data to back this this hypothesis that I'm presenting. I won't even say it's an assertion, but this hypothesis. But I am hypothesizing that the cell-mediated response plays a substantial role in ongoing, long-lasting, durable immunity when it comes to COVID-19, right? And I think that's why the vaccines are really still, to this day, very effective. They have high efficacy when it comes to keeping people from getting super sick, keeping them out of the hospital, keeping them out of the ICU, and keeping them from dying, right? Not necessarily infection, and really there aren't too many vaccines that like prevent or just like are scorched earth, completely sterilizing immunity for a disease. You don't see that as much. You could see that in like the HPV, Gardasil is very good at providing, basically sterilizing immunity. Measles as well. But most vaccines, you can still get infected, but your immune system has been primed, and it can immediately respond and prevent that infection from exacerbating. And that's still, to this day, with the OG vaccines, that's exactly what we're seeing is, yeah, there's some breakthrough, but by and large, these people aren't getting very sick. They're staying out of the hospital. They're not dying, right? High 90% of people that are going to the hospital and that are dying are unvaccinated people to this very day, 8-9 months after some of these people have been vaccinated, right? So let's keep that in mind. So increase in antibody titers does not necessarily equate to an increase in immunity. The other issue that I take with this second pillar, if you will, is the fact that 300 people is a fairly small sample size, and that's right in spite of the wrong booster being given to a few of them, the issues with randomization, the issue with the surrogate endpoints, but it's just a small number of people, and I don't feel comfortable with 300 people when it comes to more rare side effects. And we don't know, right? I think it's reasonable to assume that a booster, a third shot, is going to produce similar side effects to the second shot, but we can't really assert that because we don't have great evidence, and 300 people is not a great sample size, and there are some notable side effects. They are very rare, but they are still notable. The one that I can think of is myocarditis, right? There is a signal for myocarditis, particularly in younger biological male subjects, people that receive the second vaccine, right? That's a potential issue. And how does that translate to getting a booster? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it about the same? I don't know, right? I assume it's probably going to be similar, but I can't assert that. with a sample of 300 poorly randomized people with all the issues, right? So that's an issue to me. And then the third pillar is this quote unquote using real world data. So essentially what they did, and I believe this involves people from Israel, an Israeli study, was they collected data from, it wasn't really any sort of clinical trial or robust experiment, where you have a robust protocol and it goes through an IRB and it gets approved, right? They just kind of collected data. So there are no controls here at all, right? It's very poorly controlled. And essentially, this was a booster program that was set up in Israel, and it only included older adults and people who had chronic illnesses. And what they saw was there was a slight decrease in COVID cases and the risk for developing COVID in people, that these older chronically ill people that had the booster versus people that did not have a booster. Here's a problem. There's a very short follow-up period. It only involved a very narrow portion of the population, and there's some really weird stuff going on in the data. When you look at the data, like the most substantial protection against COVID occurred in people within 24 hours of receiving the booster. There's this super strong signal, and then it drops off, and you're kind of like, wait a minute. With everything we know about immunology, that just does not seem biologically plausible. It doesn't pass the smell test, so to speak. So there's something weird going on there, but it is most certainly not due to the booster. There's something else going on that isn't accounted for, and that makes sense because there's no randomization, there's no control. This is just, hey, there's this booster program, let's just look at these people willy-nilly and see what we can see. So these are essentially the three pillars that Pfizer put forth to say, hey, look, everybody needs a booster. And that just does not meet any kind of threshold in my mind for widely accepting and recognizing this. Now, the panel, to their credit, recommended against general or broad use of a booster or employment of a booster. Rather, they kind of made this compromise. They kind of said, well, if you're elderly, if you have chronic immunosuppression, elderly chronic immunosuppression, then it may be reasonable to get that. And that's kind of the recommendation. Now, this FDA advisory panel, there's just that. They're an advisory panel, and the FDA can, in principle, do really whatever the hell they want. And now we are seeing that the booster is rolling out, and at least where I live, there has been another. So what we're getting now, the guidance we're getting is if you're elderly, over the age of 65, chronically immunosuppressed, or if you work in kind of a high risk occupational environment like me, because I still am engaged in healthcare and work in healthcare environment, in addition to what I do as a professor. Now I fall into that group, and the way that things are being mandated, I will have to go out and get this booster, presumably. That's the guidance that we're getting. Now, as a middle-aged guy who didn't really have any issues that I know of after the first two vaccines, I'm not particularly concerned about this, but I do have concerns about mandating this based on evidence that is not particularly robust. And even the most ardent of vaccine advocates, hopefully you can pull back a little bit and really see where some of us who have concerns and questions about boosters are coming from, right? This is not great data. And I do hear I do kind of hear some people argue, well, what's the harm, right? It can't hurt anybody. Just come on, let's just do it. It's not going to hurt. Well, it may actually, right? We don't have enough data in my mind to say that it won't hurt people, right? It may not, right? I don't expect it really to, but here's the thing. The benefits really have to outweigh the risks, and that is with any kind of therapeutic that you want to think about giving. So I fully accept the data when it comes to getting vaccinated, the initial vaccine, right? That's overwhelming, strong data, large, randomized controlled trials, tens of thousands of people per trial. I have absolutely no issue wholeheartedly recommending those. But when it comes to this booster issue, I have very serious concerns, and I'm basing those concerns solely on the data. All right, I don't have any specific agenda that I'm trying to push here, only somebody who's looking at the data going, okay, does this support a favorable risk-benefit analysis? And in the absence of data, I have to say no if I'm being intellectually honest here, right? I have to say, in the absence of data, no, I do not see a compelling reason to recommend this at this time. Now, that is separate from the policy, right? I am not a policymaker. I do not impact policy. I cannot make policy. All I can do is put my voice out there, and hopefully I have presented my concerns logically using the actual data that has been given to us. So hopefully those people that are vehemently pro-vaccine at any cost can pull back a little bit from the brink, so to speak, and look at this for what it really is. So hopefully this video does some good. Hopefully it helps you, and I understand that I'm probably going to possibly receive some pushback on this. Certainly my hot take on ivermectin video kind of has the predictable results that I assumed it would, because I am not particularly heterodox in my opinion of ivermectin at this point, and I still stand by what I said. So I will be patiently waiting for that data to come through, but I'm certainly not going to hold my breath. But in this situation, looking at the data that's available, hopefully you all can see where I'm coming from. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great day. Stay safe, doing whatever it is you may be doing.